The man whose name was etched in brass on half the skyscrapers in downtown Chicago saw the woman pouring his water as little more than furniture that moved. To Sterling Blackwood, she was a function, a pair of hands in a starched black apron, notable only for the soft, lilting drawl he found intolerably common, a sound like gravel in a silk purse. He decided, in a flash of bored cruelty, to make a sport of her. He needed to demonstrate to his dinner guest, a man he considered a rival, what true, effortless dominance looked like. But in his arrogance, Blackwood made a mistake of catastrophic proportions. He assumed the woman with the quiet eyes and the gentle accent was powerless. He had no way of knowing he was speaking to Elara Vance, and that with a few carefully chosen words, she was about to uncork a truth that would shatter his world and reclaim her own. The air inside the Argent Steakhouse was thick with the scent of dry-aged beef and old money. It was a Wednesday evening, a night when Chicago's titans of industry carved up deals as readily as they carved their 40-ounce porterhouses. For the patrons of this temple of carnivory and commerce, time was measured in quarterly earnings and the hushed pop of a vintage Cabernet. For Elara Vance, whom everyone called Ellie, time was measured in 8-hour shifts, the dull ache radiating up from the soles of her feet and the precise angle at which to present a wine list. She moved through the opulent dining room, a sea of dark wood and buttery leather, with a practiced economy of motion. Her uniform was severe, a crisp white shirt, black trousers, a long black apron, designed to make her fade into the background. Her honey-blonde hair was pulled back in a simple, tight knot at the nape of her neck, a style that emphasized the sharp, observant intelligence in her pale green eyes. Most patrons never truly saw her. She was the ghost who anticipated the need for a fresh fork, the silent presence that ensured their water glasses were never less than half full. She preferred it that way. Invisibility was a form of armor. Tonight, however, her armor was about to be pierced. Table 12, the prime corner booth with a panoramic view of the glittering city lights, was occupied by Sterling Blackwood. Blackwood wasn't merely rich, he was an institution. Blackwood Properties had reshaped the city's skyline. He was a man of inherited power, the third generation to helm the empire. And he wore his wealth not with the brashness of new money, but with the unshakable bone-deep certainty of a man who believed he was genetically superior. His suit was a quiet, bespoke charcoal wool that likely cost more than Ellie's car, worn with the casual ease of a man born into it. Everything about him was understated and sharp, from the thin platinum watch on his wrist to the dismissive curl of his lip. His cruelty was not loud. It was the quiet, confident condescension of a king swatting away a fly. With him was Marcus Thorne, a man of a different breed entirely. Thorne was self-made, a logistics magnate who had built his empire from a single rusty cargo ship into a global network. His money was newer, but he wore it with a quiet respect for its origins. His suit was just as expensive as Blackwood's, but there was a tension in his shoulders that suggested he never forgot the weight of his own payroll. He was in Chicago to discuss a joint venture, a massive waterfront development project. Blackwood needed Thorne's logistical network, and Thorne needed Blackwood's political clout. The deal was worth $1 billion. The dinner was the battlefield. Ellie had served men like Sterling Blackwood her entire life. They were a particular species, men who believed their financial statements granted them the right to treat others as less than human. She approached the table, the heavy glass water pitcher cool against her palm. "Good evening, gentlemen. May I get you some water to start? We have still or sparkling." Her voice was low and clear, but it carried the unmistakable melody of her Appalachian roots, a gentle cadence that spoke of misty mountains and deep, old forests. Blackwood didn't grace her with a glance. He was in the midst of a monologue about his recent acquisition of a private island. The real challenge is dredging the channel for the yacht. Permitting is a nightmare, even for me. He waved a dismissive hand in her general direction. Sparkling. And tell your sommelier to bring a bottle of the 82 Cheval Blanc. Don't bring me the list. A very fine choice, sir, Ellie said, her face a mask of professional neutrality. Marcus Thorne, however, did look at her. His eyes, a sharp, penetrating grey, held a flicker of something. Not pity, but assessment. He gave a slight, formal nod. Still for me, please. Thank you. Ellie inclined her head and moved away, her posture ramrod straight. As she walked, she felt Blackwood's eyes on her for the first time. Not as a person, but as a minor, irritating detail in his otherwise perfect evening. She was acutely aware of the small habits she had cultivated over the years, to seem less than she was. The slight slump in her shoulders, the way she kept her gaze lowered and less directly addressed. These were the tools of survival, the camouflage of the overlooked. When she returned with the water, Blackwood was attempting to impress Thorne with his supposed connoisseurship. "The trouble with this country, Marcus," he said, his voice a low rumble of performative world weariness, "is that there's no real appreciation for the finer things. Everyone's in such a hurry. You go to a place like this, you pay a fortune for a steak, and the help sounds like they just stepped off a turnip truck from some god-forsaken holler." He looked directly at Ellie as she poured Thorne's still water, his pale blue eyes cold and amused. The insult was a perfectly aimed dart, designed to showcase his own refinement by highlighting her lack of it. It was a power play, meant to put Thorne, the self-made man, in his place as well. Ellie did not flinch. Her hand, holding the heavy pitcher, remained as steady as a surgeon's. Across the room, the restaurant's manager, a stern but fair man named Mr. Davies, stiffened. He knew Ellie was his best employee, a woman with more grace and quiet dignity than anyone on his staff. He started to move toward the table, but a barely perceptible shake of Ellie's head stopped him in his tracks. Thorne shifted uncomfortably. The remark was vulgar, a breach of the unspoken code of conduct even among ruthless businessmen. It reflected poorly on his host. "Sterling, that's unnecessary." But Blackwood was enjoying himself. He smirked at Ellie, a predator playing with its food. What is that accent, anyway? Kentucky? West Virginia? You should really try to work on that. A place of this caliber requires a certain standard. The insult hung in the air, more chilling than the perfectly conditioned atmosphere of the restaurant. The low murmur of conversations at other tables seemed to die away, as if the room itself were holding its breath. Ellie finished pouring the water. She set the pitcher down on her service tray with a soft, deliberate click. She did not look angry. She did not look humiliated. She looked focused, as if she were solving a complex problem. She lifted her head, and her pale green eyes, clear and direct, met Sterling Blackwood's smug gaze for the first time. And then she spoke. Her voice was different. The soft Appalachian drawl was gone, completely erased. In its place was a voice of crisp, crystalline precision, imbued with an authority that was absolute. The vocabulary was not merely educated, it was technical, poetic, and utterly devastating. "Sir, with respect, the 82 Cheval Blanc is a magnificent wine, a true benchmark for the right bank." However, she paused, her eyes flicking to the window, then back to him. Given the current barometric pressure and the high humidity from the lakefront this evening, its more subtle tertiary notes, the cigar box, the wet earth, the truffle, will be somewhat suppressed. The palate will feel heavier, more fruit-forward than the vintner intended. It will be a very good drink, but it will not be a transcendent experience. The silence that followed was profound. Marcus Thorne's jaw was tight, his assessing gaze now locked on Ellie with laser-like intensity. Blackwood stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief. He had been prepared for tears, for a stammered apology, for her to scurry away in shame. He was not prepared for a dissertation. Ellie continued, her voice unwavering. May I suggest an alternative? The 90s Chateau Margaux. It's a first growth, of course, but from a warmer, more generous vintage. It's showing beautifully right now, with a more expressive nose that will cut through the atmospheric density. You'll find notes of black currant, violet, and cedar, with a finish that is, in my professional opinion, significantly more elegant and prolonged. It will also pair more exquisitely with the Wagyu you'll inevitably order. She hadn't just corrected him. She had dissected his choice, exposed his superficiality, and offered a superior alternative with the calm, unassailable confidence of a master. She had used his own weapon, connoisseurship, against him, and revealed him to be an amateur. Blackwood's face, which had been pale with arrogance, began to flush a deep, mottled crimson. The humiliation was exquisite. He had tried to mock her accent, and she had replied in a language of expertise he couldn't begin to comprehend. But the true shockwave was yet to land. Marcus Thorne leaned forward, his voice a low, charged whisper. That wasn't just a recommendation. That was an analysis. The way you described the effect of barometric pressure on phenolic compounds. I've only heard one person talk like that. A man I tried to hire years ago. A man they called the finest palate in Napa. He told me he learned everything he knew from his daughter. He looked at her, truly looked at her, past the apron and the simple hairstyle. He saw the intelligence in her eyes, the quiet confidence in her posture that she had tried so hard to hide. He saw the ghost of another man's face in her features. He was a legend, Thorne continued, his voice soft with something that sounded like reverence. His name was Arthur Vance. He paused, the question hanging in the air, heavy and explosive. Who are you? Ellie's professional mask finally fractured, just for a second. A flicker of old, deep pain crossed her face before being ruthlessly suppressed. She offered Thorne a small, sad, enigmatic smile. She picked up her tray, her composure a fortress once more. I'm your server, she said, her voice reverting to the gentle, melodic drawl she had used just minutes before. I'll let the sommelier know you've decided on the Margaux. And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving a billionaire choking on his own fury and his rival staring after her. The billion-dollar development deal completely forgotten, replaced by a single, burning mystery. Sterling Blackwood had just insulted the one woman in the world who knew his darkest secret. The walk to the sommelier station felt like a mile-long tightrope walk over a canyon. The usual clatter and hum of the restaurant had faded into a dull roar in Ellie's ears. She could feel the stares from the busboys, from the other servers, from the chefs peering through the pass-through window. They had all heard it. The sudden, shocking transformation. The quiet waitress who had, with a few sentences, surgically dismantled the most powerful man in the room. Mr. Davies, the manager, met her by the wine cellar door. His face, usually a stern mask of authority, was a jumble of awe and deep concern. "Ellie," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Are you all right? What in God's name was that?" Ellie took a deep, shuddering breath, the adrenaline of the confrontation finally hitting her. Her hands, which had been so steady, now trembled slightly. She set her tray down on a polished counter. "I'm fine, Mr. Davies." He pushed a button he shouldn't have. "A button? That was a nuclear launch," he muttered, shaking his head. "The way you spoke. I have a degree in hospitality management from Cornell. I've never heard anyone break down a wine like that, not even our sommelier." "It's an old family trade," Ellie said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. She tried to busy herself by polishing a wine glass, but her mind was replaying the scene. The look on Thorne's face. Arthur Vance. The name, spoken aloud in this place, felt like a sacrilege. For 5 years, she had worked tirelessly to build this anonymous life, a life where she was just Ellie, the quiet waitress. In one moment of defending her own dignity, she had lit a match and tossed it onto the carefully constructed edifice of her new identity. And the name of the wine Blackwood had ordered, the 82 Cheval Blanc. It was her father's favorite. The choice was a cruel, cosmic joke. Back at table 12, the atmosphere was glacial. Sterling Blackwood sat rigid, his knuckles white where he gripped a steak knife. The public nature of his takedown was a new and agonizing sensation. He was a man who orchestrated every variable, who controlled every narrative. That waitress, she hadn't just defied him. She had unmasked him, revealing him as a pretender in his own temple of luxury. He felt a rage so cold and pure it was almost calming. "She's fired," he hissed, the words a venomous puff of air. "I want her out of this building before our entrees arrive. I'll buy this entire restaurant and turn it into a parking garage if I have to." Marcus Thorne barely registered the threat. He was still staring at the spot where Ellie had stood, his mind working furiously. Vance. The name was not just familiar. It was the ghost at the center of a story that had haunted Napa Valley for years. The story of the Vance estate, a small, family-owned vineyard that had produced some of the most legendary Cabernet Sauvignon in American history. A vineyard that had been lost, swallowed whole by a corporate behemoth in a hostile takeover that was as brutal as it was mysterious. "Sterling," Thorne said, his voice sharp, cutting through Blackwood's tantrum. "Forget about firing her. I want you to find out everything you can about her. Where she lives, where she's from, who she is." Blackwood blinked, thrown by the sudden change in direction. "What? Why? She's a nobody who got lucky with a wine fact." "Nobodies do not possess that level of knowledge," Thorne corrected him coolly. "That wasn't a wine fact. That was the culmination of a lifetime of experience. She didn't learn that in a training manual. She lived it. She is not who she says she is." His mind was connecting the dots, the Vance name, the almost supernatural palette, the rumors he'd heard about Arthur Vance's brilliant daughter who had vanished after the family lost everything. The girl who had been accepted to the viticulture program at UC Davis on a full scholarship before disappearing off the face of the earth. Could it possibly be? "I don't give a damn who she is," Blackwood snarled, his bruised ego roaring back to life. "Let's talk about the waterfront deal, Marcus. That's why you're here." "The deal," Thorne said, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level that finally commanded Blackwood's full attention, "is now contingent on my understanding of this situation. That woman, and what she represents, is suddenly more interesting to me than your blueprints and zoning permits. Do you understand me?" Blackwood understood. He understood that Thorne, the key to his legacy project, was now fixated on a waitress. His rage curdled into a tight knot of pragmatic dread. The power in the room had shifted, and it was now centered on the woman in the black apron. "Fine," he bit out, pulling out his phone. He sent a curt, angry text to his chief of security, a man who specialized in making problems disappear. Argent Steakhouse, Waitress. Name is Ellie, maybe a Lara. Appalachian accent. Find out everything. Address, history, family. I want a complete file by morning. Use whatever resources are necessary. This is your only priority." He slammed the phone down on the table. "It's being handled." When Ellie returned to the dining room a few minutes later, it was to inform them that the sommelier had wholeheartedly endorsed her recommendation and was decanting the 90 Margot. She avoided their table, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. But she could feel their eyes on her. Blackwood's gaze was a physical blow, filled with hatred. Thorne's was something else, entirely. Analytical, searching, and far more dangerous. Later that night, long after her shift had ended, Ellie sat in her tiny, meticulously cleaned studio apartment in a working-class neighborhood, miles from the glitter of downtown. Her sanctuary was simple: a bed, a small table, and shelves overflowing with books, not novels but dense textbooks on soil chemistry, organic viticulture, and the history of winemaking. On her wall was a single faded photograph, a laughing man with kind eyes and sun-crinkled skin, his arm around a teenage girl with the same pale green eyes as her own. They were standing in a field of grapevines, the California sun casting a golden glow over them. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from Mr. Davies. "Ellie, a man was in the restaurant after you left. Not a customer. Asking about you. Said he was from Blackwood's office. I told him our employee files were confidential, but he was very persistent. Be careful." Ellie closed her eyes, a wave of exhaustion washing over her. The hunt had officially begun. Blackwood was looking for a weapon to destroy her. Thorne was looking for a key to a mystery. Both men were about to rip the lid off the past she had buried 5 years ago. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the marrow, that they were about to unearth the tragic story of Ilara Vance, the heiress who had lost an empire, and whose greatest secret was not her knowledge of wine, but the reason she had to hide it. The next morning, a sleek encrypted file landed in Sterling Blackwood's inbox. He opened it in his penthouse office, the city of Chicago sprawling beneath him like a personal kingdom. He had been awake all night, the waitress's calm, authoritative voice echoing in his mind. The file was distressingly thin. Name: Ilara Vance. Current address: a studio apartment in Pilsen, leased 5 years ago. Employment history: Waitress, the Argent, 2 years. Prior to that, various service industry jobs: diner waitress, barista, under the name Ellie Vance. Financials: 1 active bank account with a modest balance. No credit cards, no loans, no digital footprint to speak of, no social media. It's like she fell from the sky 5 years ago. "This is it!" Blackwood roared into his intercom at his head of security. "This is what you get for $50,000 in overnight fees." "Sir," the voice crackled back, "the woman is a ghost. We ran her face through every database we have. State, federal, international. Nothing. The name Ilara Vance has no official existence before 5 years ago. It's likely an alias." Blackwood slammed his fist on the mahogany desk. An alias. It only deepened the mystery and his fury. Who was she? How did she know about wine like that? And more importantly, how did she know to recommend the Margot, a wine from a vineyard he had a secret, personal connection to? It couldn't be a coincidence. His phone buzzed. It was Marcus Thorne. Sterling. Thorne's voice was crisp, all business. "Cancel our meeting for this morning. I've made a few calls of my own. I'm having my jet prepped. I'm flying to Chicago. I believe we need to speak with Miss Vance directly." "What do you mean, we?" Blackwood snapped. "This is my problem. I'll handle it. I'll have her sign an NDA with a severance check that will choke a horse." There was a dry, humorless laugh on the other end of the line. "Sterling, you still don't get it, do you? You think this is about an employee who embarrassed you. I think this is about the ghost of Vance estate. Money is not going to solve this problem. It might just be the thing that caused it." The line went dead. Ellie, meanwhile, was living on a knife's edge. Mr. Davies's text had been a warning shot. She knew they were coming for her. She went to her job at the Argent, her senses on high alert. Every new customer, every lingering glance, felt like a threat. She performed her duties with her usual quiet efficiency. But inside, she was a maelstrom of fear and resolve. Her past was not just a gilded cage, it was a graveyard. She was the last of the Vance line, a family that had cultivated wine in Napa Valley for a century. Their estate was small but legendary, producing wines that were whispered about by collectors with the reverence usually reserved for holy relics. Her father, Arthur Vance, was an artist whose medium was soil and sunlight. Ellie was his prodigy. By the age of 10, she could identify the clone of a Cabernet grape by the shape of its leaf. By 16, she could blind taste a wine and tell you not only the vintage, but the weather patterns of that year, and which block of the vineyard the grapes had come from. He called it the gift. It was a deep, instinctual understanding of the land and its fruit. Her life was mapped out. UC Davis, then working alongside her father and eventually taking over the estate. Then Sterling Blackwood arrived, or rather, his corporate arm, a soulless subsidiary called AgriCorp Global. They wanted to buy Vance Estate. Her father refused. The land was their soul, not a commodity. So AgriCorp began a campaign of slow, crushing warfare. They bought up the neighboring properties, diverting water sources. They filed frivolous lawsuits, draining the Vances' modest finances with legal fees. They engaged in corporate espionage, stealing their unique yeast cultures. The final blow came when a freak, unseasonable frost threatened their entire harvest, the one that was meant to save them. Her father had invested everything in a new, experimental wind machine system to protect the buds. The night of the frost, the system mysteriously failed. The entire crop was lost. Ruined and heartbroken, facing foreclosure, Arthur Vance had a massive heart attack and died among his withered vines. A week later, AgriCorp Global bought the Vance estate, its priceless old vines, and its legendary name for pennies on the dollar at a bankruptcy auction. Ellie, 20 years old and utterly alone, was left with nothing but a box of her father's tasting notes and a burning conviction that the system failure hadn't been an accident. She knew Blackwood was responsible, but she had no proof. She was a grieving girl against a corporate empire. So she ran. She erased herself. She took a new name, moved to a city where no one knew her, and buried Alara Vance, the wine prodigy, deep inside Ellie Vance, the anonymous waitress. The Appalachian accent was her shield, a piece of her mother's heritage she adopted to create a persona no one would ever connect to the rarefied world of Napa Valley. For 5 years, the shield had held. Now it was cracking. That evening, as she was leaving work, a sleek black town car pulled up to the curb beside her. The back window glided down, revealing Marcus Thorne. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice polite but firm. "Please get in, we need to talk." Ellie's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. She could run. But where to? They would find her again. With a deep breath, she straightened her shoulders, walked to the car, and got in. The door closed with a solid, definitive thud. The car moved silently through the city streets. Thorne didn't speak immediately. He simply watched her, his grey eyes missing nothing. "My father considered your father a genius," he said finally. "And a friend." I was there, the day he tried to warn Arthur about Blackwood. He told him to sell, to take the money and start over somewhere else. He said Blackwood wasn't a businessman. He was a predator. Tears pricked at the back of Ellie's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. My father believed in the land. He thought that was enough. I know what happened to the estate, Thorne said, his voice softening slightly. And I know Blackwood's company, Agricorp, owns it now. What I don't know is why you're here, pouring water in his favorite steakhouse. Sometimes the best place to hide is in plain sight, Ellie said, her voice barely a whisper. And sometimes you have to watch your enemy to understand how to fight him. It was a half-truth. She had also been paralyzed by grief, unsure of what to do next. Blackwood is in Chicago because of our waterfront deal, Thorne said, getting to the point. But he's also here to host a private, incredibly high-stakes wine auction next week. The centerpiece of the auction is a collection of extremely rare, pre-corporate, Vance Estate Cabernet Sauvignon, bottles from your father's last perfect vintage. He's using your family's legacy to court investors. The blood drained from Ellie's face. Blackwood wasn't just living in her home. He was selling off the last pieces of her father's soul to the highest bidder. It was the ultimate desecration. "He can't," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "Some of those bottles, they're not stable." My father was experimenting with a new bottling technique. Without proper storage, they could be flawed. They could be vinegar by now. Thorne's eyes narrowed. Flawed? How flawed? It depends on the bottle. Some might be perfect, others undrinkable. Only someone who was there, who knows the specific batch numbers, could tell the difference. A dangerous, audacious idea began to form in her mind, a spark of the old Vance fire. Thorne saw the shift in her expression. He saw the grief recede, replaced by a cold, calculating anger. He was a man who respected a good strategy above all else. "He's under a lot of pressure," Thorne said, thinking aloud. "His last few projects have been over budget and behind schedule. He needs this waterfront deal to shore up his reputation. A public failure at this auction, in front of the very people he needs to impress, would be catastrophic for him." He looked at Ellie, a slow smile spreading across his face. He wasn't a white knight, and this wasn't about justice. It was about opportunity. He saw a way to gain leverage over his rival and, perhaps, do right by his old friend's daughter in the process. "It seems to me, Miss Vance," Marcus Thorne said, "that Sterling Blackwood is about to sell a collection of wine of uncertain quality, and you are the only person in the world who knows its true value." Ellie met his gaze, her own eyes shining with a dangerous light. The waitress was gone. Elara Vance was back. "Yes," she said, her voice no longer a whisper, but the clear, confident tone of an expert. "I am." The plan they hatched was audacious, a high-wire act of deception and expertise. It hinged on Ellie's unique knowledge and Thorne's resources. Thorne's legal team drafted a simple, ironclad agreement. He would provide the platform and the backing. Ellie would provide the expertise. In return for her role, Thorne would fund a legal challenge to investigate the acquisition of Vance Estate, using any leverage they gained to force a settlement. It wasn't about getting the land back. That was a near impossibility, but about achieving a measure of justice, and perhaps a future. The auction was to be held in the grand ballroom of a historic Chicago hotel. The guest list was a who's who of global finance and industry. Sterling Blackwood was positioning the event as the social coup of the season. The centerpiece was Lot 113, the Arthur Vance Legacy Collection, 12 bottles from the final, legendary 2018 vintage. The pre-auction estimates were astronomical, starting at over $250,000. Ellie spent the days leading up to the auction in a suite at the Four Seasons, courtesy of Thorne. Her world transformed overnight. The waitress uniform was replaced by a wardrobe of understated, elegant clothing. But the real transformation was internal. She pored over her father's old notebooks, which Thorne had flown in from a secure storage unit in California. The pages were filled with his familiar script, detailing soil pH, rainfall, sugar levels and fermentation times. And there, in the margins of the 2018 vintage, were the notes she was looking for. He had been experimenting with a new, untested corking method meant to allow for micro-oxygenation. He had marked the experimental bottles with a tiny, almost invisible scribe mark on the bottom of the punt. Batch C7. Corks feel tight. Watch for TCA or premature oxidation. TCA, trichloroanisole, the dreaded cork taint, a chemical compound that could ruin a wine, giving it a musty, wet cardboard aroma. To an amateur it might be missed. To a connoisseur it was a fatal flaw. The night of the auction, the ballroom glittered. Blackwood stood at the podium, a smug emperor surveying his domain. Ellie entered the room on Marcus Thorne's arm. She wore a simple, dark green velvet dress, her hair styled in a soft chignon. She looked poised, elegant, and completely anonymous. No one would ever connect this woman with the waitress from the Argent. Blackwood saw Thorne enter, and his eyes narrowed. But he didn't recognize Ellie. To him, she was just another beautiful woman, accompanying a business rival. The bidding was fierce. Ellie and Thorne sat silently, watching. When Lot 113 was announced, a hush fell over the room. The auctioneer began his spiel, extolling the virtues of the mythical Vance estate. "We will open the bidding at $250,000, the auctioneer declared. Hands shot up around the room. The price climbed rapidly. 300,000, 350, 400. Blackwood watched, a triumphant smirk on his face. "Mr. Thorne," Ellie whispered, her voice calm. "The third bottle from the left, on the display stand. Can you see the light reflecting off the bottom?" Thorne squinted. "I see it. That's from batch C7, she said. "It's tainted." Thorne raised his bidding paddle. 500,000, he called out, his voice booming through the silent room. A gasp went through the crowd. Blackwood's smirk widened. He thought Thorne was trying to outspend him for pride. The bidding war was on. Another bidder countered. Thorne immediately topped it. Finally, it was down to Thorne and a European industrialist. $750,000, the industrialist bid. $1 million, Thorne said coolly, without hesitation. The room erupted in murmurs. The industrialist shook his head and withdrew. "Sold!" the auctioneer cried, banging his gavel. "To Mr. Marcus Thorne for $1 million. Blackwood was ecstatic. Not only had he achieved a record-breaking price, but he had taken $1 million from his rival. He strode over to their table, his face glowing with victory. "Marcus," he gloated, "I didn't take you for a sentimentalist. $1 million for some old grape juice. Though I must admit, it is the best." "We'll see about that," Thorne said, signing the payment slip. "As is tradition with a lot of this significance, I'd like to open one bottle now to share with a few select guests, a toast to the legacy of Arthur Vance." Blackwood's face paled slightly. This was not part of the plan. Opening a bottle would decrease the value of the collection, but to refuse would be a major faux pas. "Of course," he said through a tight smile. A sommelier was summoned. A table was prepared on the stage. The collection was brought forward. "Which bottle would you like to open, Mr. Thorne?" the sommelier asked. Thorne looked at Ellie. Ellie stood up and walked toward the stage. Her heart was pounding, but her steps were steady. All eyes were on her. She approached the table and pointed. "That one?" she said, her voice clear and carrying through the silent room. "The third from the left." The sommelier carefully picked up the bottle. As he began to cut the foil, Ellie spoke again. "Before you open that," she said, addressing the room, "my name is Elara Vance. Arthur Vance was my father." A collective gasp swept through the ballroom. Sterling Blackwood froze, his face turning the color of ash. He stared at her, and for the first time he saw her. He saw the waitress from the Argent. The blood drained from his face as the trap sprung shut. "This vintage," Ellie continued, her voice filled with the quiet authority she had displayed in the restaurant, "was a time of great experimentation for my father. He was testing a new corking method on certain batches, a method that, he feared, could lead to a high probability of TCA contamination." The sommelier paused, the corkscrew halfway in. The word TCA hung in the air like a death sentence. "Please," Ellie said, her eyes locking on Blackwood's, "open the bottle." With trembling hands, the sommelier extracted the cork. He poured a small amount into a glass and brought it to his nose. His professional smile vanished, replaced by a look of horror. He subtly shook his head at Blackwood. "Allow me," Ellie said. She took the glass, swirled it, and held it to her nose. Her expression didn't change. She then walked directly to Sterling Blackwood. You are selling my father's legacy," she said, her voice a low, resonant tremor of controlled fury, pitched for his ears only. "You built a palace on the rubble of his life. The least you can do is taste the fruits of your victory." She held the glass out to him, not as an offering, but as a judgment. Her hand was rock steady. Every eye in the vast, glittering ballroom, hundreds of pairs of eyes belonging to the most powerful people in the world, was fixed on this silent tableau. Sterling Blackwood was trapped in a spotlight of his own making. To refuse the glass was to confess the wine was flawed. To admit his entire auction was a fraud. To accept it was to submit to her, to drink from the chalice of his own public execution. The silence in the room was no longer expectant. It was predatory. With a slowness that felt like a geologic age, his hand, visibly trembling, rose and took the glass. The crystal felt impossibly heavy, a weight of history and consequence. He saw his reflection in the deep ruby liquid, a distorted, terrified mask of a man. He raised it to his lips, the cloying, musty scent of decay already assaulting his senses. He took the smallest, most cowardly of sips. The effect was not merely instantaneous, it was retroactive. The taste was a horror, a damp, mouldy rot that clawed at the back of his throat. But beneath the chemical signature of TCA, there was something else, a phantom sensation that ripped through the present and plunged him into a forgotten corner of his own past. It was the taste of failure, the taste of the cheap, sour wine his own father, a man of brutal standards and impossible expectations, had once forced him to drink after he'd failed a boarding school exam. "You have no palate, Sterling." His father's voice echoed in the cavern of his skull, cold and dismissive. "Not for wine, not for business, not for anything of value. You only know how to take what others have built." A flicker of pure, unadulterated revulsion crossed his face, a spasm he was powerless to control. It was the face of a boy being told he was worthless, a look of such profound shame that it silenced the room more effectively than a gunshot. He had just sold $1 million memory of his own inadequacy. Ellie watched the mask of the Titan crumble, saw the terrified boy beneath, and felt not a shred of pity. She turned back to the stunned audience, her voice ringing with the clarity of a bell in the dead of winter. "It seems this particular bottle is not showing well tonight," she said, her tone a blade of ice wrapped in velvet. "A tragedy. The ghost in the machine, as my father used to call it. A flaw that can hide for years, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself." Her eyes swept across the display of the other 11 bottles. One wonders how many other ghosts are waiting in this collection. As the sole heir to the Vance estate and its intellectual property, its very soul, I cannot in good conscience allow this auction to proceed. These bottles are not commodities. They are a history, and it appears their history has been corrupted. She did not need to raise her voice. Her quiet words detonated in the ballroom, turning Blackwood's triumph into a public relations apocalypse. The investors he'd sought to dazzle were now staring at him with a mixture of contempt and morbid fascination. He wasn't a connoisseur. He was a fraud. He wasn't a kingmaker. He was a fool who'd paid a fortune to be unmasked by a ghost. Marcus Thorne rose slowly to his feet, a silent, formidable pillar beside Ellie. He hadn't said a word, but his presence was an endorsement, a final, crushing weight on the scales of power. He had not merely won a corporate battle. He had borne witness to a reckoning. Blackwood was ruined, not by market forces or a hostile takeover, but by the unassailable truth spoken by a woman he had dismissed as furniture. The ghost of Vance Estate had returned, not to haunt, but to reclaim the narrative. And in her hand, she held the shattered pieces of his future. The fallout was a cascade of quiet, lethal collapses. There was no single cataclysm, just a series of doors softly clicking shut all over the city. The waterfront project was put on indefinite hold as investors, citing market volatility, withdrew their capital. The board of Blackwood Properties, a group of men who valued perception above all else, convened an emergency meeting from which Sterling emerged looking 10 years older, his authority irrevocably fractured. The story of the auction became a legend, a piece of Chicago folklore whispered in exclusive clubs and boardrooms, a cautionary tale about the dangers of hubris and the ghosts of small family vineyards. Blackwood did not reach out through lawyers. 2 days after the auction, a single, terse email arrived in Ellie's inbox. It was from his personal account. The subject line was empty. The body contained only an address, his penthouse, and a time. It was not a request. It was a summons from a king who didn't yet realize he'd been deposed. Ellie went alone. Thorne had offered to accompany her, to bring his legal team, but she refused. This was not a negotiation. It was a final accounting, and it had to be personal. The penthouse was a cathedral of glass and steel, a monument to sterile power perched high above the city. Blackwood was waiting for her, standing before a floor-to-ceiling window, his back to her. He looked smaller without the armor of an audience. "How much?" he asked, his voice rough, not turning around. "Just to name the number. I'll have it in your account within the hour. Then you disappear again." "There is no number," Ellie said, her voice calm in the cavernous space. She walked not toward him, but toward a small, refrigerated wine cellar built into the wall, its glass door showcasing a collection of the world's most expensive labels. "You still think this is about money? You think you can purchase an ending to this story?" "Everything has a price," he snarled, finally turning to face her. His eyes were bloodshot, his bespoke suit rumpled. "It's the one truth in this world." "You're wrong," she said, her gaze drifting over the bottles. "My father's life didn't have a price. The soil he spent 40 years nurturing doesn't have a price. The knowledge he passed to me." She paused, her eyes meeting his. "That is priceless, and it's the one thing you could never buy, so you decided to destroy it instead." He took a step toward her, his face a mask of fury and confusion. "I don't know what you're talking about. It was a business acquisition." "Was it business when your agents filed 27 frivolous legal challenges in 18 months to bleed my father's resources dry? Was it business when you bought the adjacent properties and systematically choked his water rights? Was it business when your consultant, a man with a documented history of industrial sabotage, was in Napa the very week my father's frost protection system suffered a catastrophic, inexplicable failure?" She recited the facts without emotion, each one a hammer blow against his paper-thin defense. "You didn't just outcompete him, Mr. Blackwood. You hunted him." He stared at her, speechless. The raw, ugly truth of it, spoken aloud in his own sanctuary, left him naked. "Why?" Ellie asked, her voice dropping to a near whisper. It was the only question that mattered. Why go to such lengths? Vance Estate was small. It wasn't a threat. It was beautiful. Why did you have to crush it? For a long moment, he said nothing. He walked to the window, looking down at the city that bore his name. "Because he had something I never did," he said, the words torn from him. "My father built half of this city. My grandfather built the other half. They were giants, and all I have ever done is manage their legacy. I acquire things. I leverage assets. I don't create anything." He turned back, his eyes hollow. "I visited your father once, years ago, under a different name. I wanted to see the man who made the wine everyone talked about. He wasn't in an office. He was on his knees in the dirt, tasting the soil. He spoke about the land like it was a living thing, like he was in conversation with it. He looked at a handful of dirt and saw the vintage of 2028. He was an artist. He was authentic. And I hated him for it. I hated him because his small patch of dirt had more meaning than this entire building, more than my entire life." The confession hung in the air, pathetic and profound. It was the howl of a hollow man. He hadn't destroyed Vance Estate for profit, but out of a desperate, envious rage against a beauty he could not possess. Ellie listened, and the burning anger within her cooled, replaced by a vast, empty sadness. Her enemy wasn't a monster. He was just a small man rattling around in a giant's cage. Vengeance suddenly felt pointless. What she wanted was something far more difficult, far more transformative. "I don't want your money," she said, her voice regaining its strength. "I want justice." But my father's idea of justice was always rooted in the soil. It was about balance, restoration. She walked to the center of the room, now the one in command. "You will not sell the Vance Estate. You will not develop it. You will not touch the name. Instead, you will establish a trust, an independent entity. The land will be placed within it, protected in perpetuity. And you," she said, her eyes locking onto his, "will fund it, not with a one-time payment, but with an annual endowment for the next 30 years. "Fine," he croaked, relieved. "A foundation. I can do that." "Oh, I'm not finished," Ellie said, a cold smile touching her lips. "The trust will have a single, primary mission: to restore the vineyard to its former health after years of your corporate neglect. And it will have a single, non-negotiable apprentice. You." Blackwood blinked. "What?" "For 1 month, every summer, for the next 5 years, you will live and work on that land. You will not be Sterling Blackwood, CEO. You will be an apprentice. You will learn to prune the vines my father planted. You will learn to walk the rows and test the ripeness of the grapes. You will get the soil of the land you destroyed under your fingernails. You will report to the vineyard manager, a man I will choose. You will learn, in the most intimate way possible, exactly what it is you took." He stared at her, his face a canvas of disbelief and horror. It was a punishment of genius. Not a fine, not a prison sentence, but a penance. She was sentencing him to 5 years of confronting his own inadequacy, of trying and failing to understand the artistry he had so casually annihilated. It was a public humiliation that would be intensely private, a wound that would fester year after year. "You're insane," he whispered. "Those are my terms," Ellie said, walking toward the door. "That, or the full force of Marcus Thorne's legal team, and the public story of what you've just confessed to me. Your choice. My lawyers will be in touch." She left him there, a king alone in his castle, finally understanding the true meaning of being powerless. The resolution was not a fairy tale ending. It was the beginning of a different, more complicated story. Ellie did not move back to California. The ghosts there were still too loud. She stayed in Chicago, the city that had been her refuge and had become her proving ground. With a portion of the initial trust endowment, a consulting fee Thorne's lawyers insisted upon, she bought a small brownstone in a quiet neighborhood. In the back, she cultivated a garden, her hands finally back in the soil. She took her father's notebooks, his life's work, and began to build something new. She became a consultant, a whisperer for small, family-owned vineyards on the brink of collapse. She traveled the world, from Oregon to Tuscany to the Finger Lakes, sharing her unique, inherited gift. She didn't teach them how to make Vance wine. She taught them how to listen to their own land, how to find the authentic voice of their own soil. She was no longer just the keeper of her father's legacy. She was its diaspora, planting seeds of his philosophy in struggling vineyards across the globe. Once a year, she received a short, formal report from the vineyard manager at the trust in Napa. The first year, the report on their new apprentice was scathing, arrogant, clumsy, resentful. The second year, sullen but competent with the pruning shears. The third, he asked a question today about the soil pH. Ellie would read these reports and feel a strange, complex peace. It wasn't forgiveness. It was the slow, patient process of balance being restored. One crisp autumn evening, 2 years after the auction, Marcus Thorne visited her in Chicago. They sat in her garden, the scent of late-season herbs in the cool air, sharing a bottle of wine she had helped a small Ohio vineyard produce. "I received an interesting offer today," he said, swirling the wine in his glass. "From a consortium. They want to buy out the trust, bulldoze the old vines, and build luxury homes. They offered an obscene amount of money." "What did you tell them?" Ellie asked, her heart not even fluttering. "I told them that some things are not for sale," he said, meeting her eyes over the rim of his glass. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a simple manila folder. He slid it across the table. "My father was a soybean farmer. He lost everything. I spent my life building an empire so I would never feel that powerless again. But in all that time, I never once put my own hands back in the dirt." Ellie opened the folder. Inside was the deed to 100 acres of unplanted, rolling hills in the Eola-Amity region of Oregon. The land was in her name. "It's a blank page, Alara," he said softly. "Not to rebuild your father's house, but to build your own." She looked at the deed, then at the vast, star-dusted sky above her small Chicago garden. She was no longer Ellie the waitress, hiding from the world. She was no longer just Alara, the daughter defined by a famous vineyard. She was something new, forged in loss and fire, a synthesis of both. She had discovered that a true legacy is not something you inherit, like a plot of land or a famous name. It is the knowledge you carry inside you, and the grace with which you choose to share it. And for the first time since she was a little girl, standing in a sun-drenched field, she felt the thrill of an unknown vintage, a future waiting to be cultivated. At long last, she was free.